Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the distinguished public lecture by Professor Sir Christopher Pissarides, the 2010 Nobel laureate in economic sciences and the Regius Professor of Economics from the London School of Economics and Political Sciences. My name is Clement Tu, and I am an MSc student in the Department of Economics from the Chinese University, and I'll be your MC for tonight. Tonight, we're greatly honored to have invited Professor Pissarides to deliver a lecture on the university campus. However, before we begin, may I please invite Professor Benjamin Hua, the Provost of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, to deliver the welcoming address. Thank you.
Dear students, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce Professor Christopher Pissarides. Sir Christopher Antonio Pissarides is a Greek Cypriot, born in 1948 in Nicosia. After school in Cyprus, he moved to Britain, studying economics at the University of Essex, where he gained his BA in 1970 and MA in 1971, before transferring to the London School of Economics and Political Science, and completing his PhD in 1973. He spent the next 2 years as a lecturer at the University of Southampton before returning to LSE in 1976. He has remained at LSE ever since and now is the Regius Professor of Economics at LSE. He also had long visits in the top US universities, including Harvard, Princeton, and UC Berkeley, and I know that he is now currently at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology visiting as well. Professor Pissarides specializes in the economics of labor markets, macroeconomic policy, economic growth, and structural change. In particular, he is mostly known for his contributions to the search and matching theory for studying the interactions between the labor market and the macroeconomy. He developed the concept of the matching function, which helps in understanding the flow between unemployment and employment at a given moment of time, and pioneered the empirical work on its estimation. In 1994, Sir Christopher Pissarides teamed up with Dale Martenson to distill their individual work over the previous 2 decades into an influential paper, Job Creation and Job Destruction in the Theory of Unemployment. The Mortenson-Pissarides model has been exceptionally influential in modern macroeconomics, opening an era of the analysis of endogenous job creation and destruction. In one or other of the extensions or variations, today it is part of the core of most graduate economics curricula throughout the world. Professor Pissarides was awarded the 2010 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, jointly with Dale Martenson of Northwestern University and Peter Diamond of Massachusetts Institute of Technology for his work in labor markets with frictions. He is also the first European economist to win the Institute for Study of Labor Prize in Labor Economics, jointly with his collaborator Dale Martenson in 2005. He is a Fellow of the Econometric Society, Fellow of the British Academy, the Academy of Athens, the Academia Europaea, and several other learned societies. He has been honored by several universities worldwide with doctorates or professorships. In 2011, he served as the president of the European Economic Association. He is also a lifetime honorary member of the American Economic Association. He received the Grand Cross of the Republic of Cyprus, the highest honor of the Republic, in 2011, and he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom in 2013. Today, we are delighted to have the opportunity to listen to Professor Pissarides to speak on a timely and important issue, the new normal in China, lessons from Europe in the transition to a post-industrialized society. Let's warmly welcome Professor Pissarides to the stage.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for that introduction, Professor Wang. And thank you very much for the opportunity to visit your university for a week. I've already spent 3 days here, and I've been very impressed and very stimulated by by the people I met and by the conversations we had in the Department of Economics. It's a department that has a lot of people working very closely to my interests of research, and it makes a wonderful break for me to leave Europe with its problems and come here and find such a good, vibrant academic environment and be able to spend some time discussing academic matters like the good old days at the LSE, because I spend most of my time now advising the Republic of Cyprus how to get out of its euro crisis. And they spend most of their time not listening to my advice. I don't know if they would have been any better off if they listened to it, actually, but at least I know they don't. And the only, in the recent weeks, the only outcome I've seen of that advice is extensive criticism in the press about the things that I say to them they should be doing, and the government not following them. So it's wonderful being in such a good academic environment and being able to talk about economics. Now, you mentioned that, and very rightly so, that my main contributions in economics are about, for what they're worth, actually, they're about unemployment and matching in the labor market. And of course, those are very important problems, especially for young people like you, that you have to face them when you come out of this protective environment in the near future. But what I've chosen to talk about today is the second big interest of mine in economics, what's known as the structural transformation that economists go through during economic development. And I should say that this is joint work with my collaborator, Rachel and Guy at the London School of Economics, a project that we started about 15 years ago, I guess now, and it's been very successful. It led to a marriage and to a young child and all that. But the academic work that we're doing here, I discovered from going to China, is that it's very related to what the Chinese leadership nowadays are calling the new normal, by which they mean the reduction in the very fast rates of economic growth they've been experiencing. Only yesterday I saw in the English language Chinese press here over the breakfast table, and they tell that there was a long discussion about the slowing down of, today, in fact, not yesterday, about slowing down of inflation in China and what that means for economic growth. And it's very closely related to what I'm going to say. So I'm going to talk for about half an hour, hopefully, about this topic, and then we'll move over there. From what I understand, we can take questions, and I'd be very happy to answer questions about unemployment issues as well, even though I will not raise many questions about unemployment in this talk. So let me then begin with just a very brief introduction, one slide only on the recent history, and it is that, as we know, China has been going through very fast rates of economic growth. Other countries, of course, have experienced those rates of economic growth, but not for the length of time that China has been experiencing them. I think, Japan went through this, and the Republic of Korea did, but not for this number of years. So the question is whether they can be sustained, and it's obvious that they cannot be sustained indefinitely, but one of the questions is how long can they be sustained for? And if you sort of ask, why, what's been causing these very fast rates of economic growth is obviously from the opening up of the economy in the 1980s. But if you look behind that in the sort of structure of the labor market and what's been causing the labor market, then obviously what's been bringing this economic growth is the movement of labor from unproductive agriculture to industry at fairly low wages, definitely very low by international standards, maybe not low compared with what they were earning in agriculture before. And then the reliance on cheap labor to produce manufacturing products that have are very competitive in international markets. So when asking, is it possible for this kind of trend to continue? Well, then, if you look at and I'm going to show you later on more detailed statistics, but if you look at the statistics, there is still about more than a third of the employment level, about 35 to 40% of labor is still employed in agriculture. Although real wages are rising at the low end because of that movement from agriculture to industry and services, wages are still low by international standards. The quality of manufacturing is good, despite some negative comments frequently received in the West, but I don't think they are justified. I mean, obviously, compare the quality of manufacturing with the top end of German industry, they don't look as good, but then, if you can afford to pay German prices, then good luck to you. So there's no reason why this shouldn't continue for a short time. And what I mean by short time, I mean, it could be a decade or something. But of course, what the Chinese leadership mean when they are saying that there is a new normal of lower growth rates, they call 6% a low growth rate, which by anyone's standards would be extremely high growth rate. And then the other thing I should say before I start that is it's not the end of the world if growth rates come down. I mean, the United States has had growth rates of about 2% for 200 years, and they got to where they got to. It is possible to enjoy good lives with low growth rates. But the question is the question I'm going to address here, in fact, is as the Chinese economy is coming to the end of these very fast growth rates, going up to 10%, what are the things that they should pay attention to now and over the next decade, the next program of economic development, so as to ensure that you have a soft landing at a higher level than where you are now, in a way. That's the key question. It's not that we're sinking into depression because growth rates are down to 6%. Okay, so where you would expect to see this, and it's when you see agricultural labor drying up. I mean, I wouldn't call 35% the drying up of agricultural labor. I would call 10% the drying up of agricultural labor. And then you should expect to see wages rising faster, which is only just and fair because you want growth to be inclusive, and the best way to achieve inclusive growth, to include everyone, and the best way to achieve inclusive growth is through increasing wages throughout the spectrum. And then other countries like India and other Asian neighbors here will take over as the competitive low-cost producers, and eventually Africa. And as someone asked me in a previous presentation, what happens when Africa does that and goes up to a higher level? Who is going to provide these manufacturing goods in the future? And I said, well, it's too far in the future to worry us anyway. But of course, the answer to that is that machinery, robots, will be providing that kind of low-cost manufacturing goods. I don't think we need to worry about running out of labor with a population of 7 billion in the world. Okay, so the new normal, which, as I was saying, you might expect it to go another decade or so, is that you're going to enter a normal situation of lower growth rates. It doesn't matter what they're going to be, but they're going to be lower than what they are now. They're going to be positive for sure. The service sector will dominate employment, which is going to be my main focus here. And the share of agriculture will shrink. In fact, if we use Western economies as a guide, then agriculture should go below 10%, industry would be about 20-25%, and the rest would all be services. And there is no reason to expect anything different because so far the growth of the Chinese economy mirrors very much what's been happening in Western economies. I can show you a scenario of what I mean by that. This is a typical scenario that Western economies are following. Of course, the United States, because the one that is most advanced in this kind of transformation. What you see, the green line is agricultural employment. You can see that at the time of the Civil War in the 1870s, agriculture was employing about 50% of the population. Industry and services more or less equal shares on the other. Agriculture has been coming monotonically, consistently down since then, and now it's employing about 2% of the population. But it's so efficient that even at 2%, it supplies a lot more food than what Americans need to eat. And that's why they waste a lot and they export a lot. And that's also a feature of British agriculture, actually. I mean, I say, as someone of Greek origin who lives in Britain, and I do like to go for country walks frequently, it astonishes me when I walk through the British countryside that I go through footpaths to agricultural land, and you don't see anyone at all in fields. I mean, I've also done it in China. You do see a lot of people working on their trees and little growths. In Britain, you don't. You only see machinery. Once I got totally lost in the Oxford countryside, which I'm sure there are people here who know it much better than I do. I got totally all I could meet was cows and bulls, and it was that scary. I just couldn't find a way out. There were no people. Until eventually I found someone talking even more proper English than Oxford professors, and asked him if I could find my way out. I mean, it basically is being dehumanized, completely mechanized, and that's why you get the 2% employment here, producing so much food. But more interesting is if you ignore the Great Depression of the 1930s, I think the most interesting pattern here is to see what happens to industrial employment. In that following the industrialization of the United States after the Civil War, industrial employment was going up until it reached about 40%, which is more or less where China is now, in fact. It's even a little bit higher, in fact, I think, than where China is now. And then it stayed at 40% until 1970, when the big slowdown began. And then industrial employment, if you sort of want to take a negative aspect, is that it collapsed completely, but now it employs just over 20%. Now, of course, American industry is producing more goods than it was producing in 1970. It's just that technology has made it so much more productive and robotics that they don't need people anymore to produce it. And all those people moved on to services, labor-intensive services. So when we mean a new normal, I think that's what we mean. We mean this period here, with industrial employment going down, and agricultural employment and service employment taking over. These are the Chinese figures, the comparable Chinese figures that I was able to find. And you can see agriculture doing more or less the same. The green line again going down to about 35% employment now. But services and industry still rising together, and industry, in fact, only at 30%, whereas, as I showed you, the United States got up to 40% before it declined. That's why I'm saying there's still future in industrial employment, although technology now is more capital intensive in industry than it was in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. So maybe you wouldn't even expect industrial employment to go up to 40% before it declines. But what you should expect to see here is this red line in what they call the new normal to start going down, and the blue line just to accelerate and go further up as the deindustrialization of the economy happens. And because, and I thought I'd make a comparison with a European country which developed more recently, that is Spain. And in fact, you do see parallels with Spain. The Spanish industrial employment in 1970 was about just over 30%, service employment just over 40%, and it compares a little bit with where China is around 2000. But then you get the monotonic decline in industrial employment and the monotonic increase in service employment, whereas in China you still have growth in industrial employment. So, but in Spain around this, by 2000, agricultural employment was way down. I mean, it became a service economy, more or less. So, so much for the new normal. That's what it's going to be: decline in industrial employment, decline in rates of growth, rise in labor-intensive service jobs. So, how do you manage that transition? And that's their main concern. Well, first of all, you need to find the comparative advantage of the country in trade, because it does need to continue trading competitively in world markets. Second, it needs to manage the fast growth of service jobs and the decline in industrial jobs, and that, I think, is going to be the most difficult thing given where we are now, and I'm going to explain why. And finally, being of European origin, I do have to worry about the welfare state and how to support poverty. And again, there's a lot of work to do. And I'm going to point out some general guidelines of what we've discovered now after years of experience with that kind of welfare state. So let me begin with the easiest of all, which is production and trade. It's going to be fairly obvious to you, but I just mention it quickly because it's important enough. I mean, to help the transition, what business leaders need to find, I mean, much more business leaders in the private sector than the state, in fact, they need to find and cultivate what China can do better relatively to other countries, not in absolute terms, but in relative terms, what economists call the law of comparative advantage. What matters is where you can do relatively better than other countries in relation to the other goods you produce, and you specialize into those goods. And here you should take into account both manufacturing goods, but also services, because a lot of services are being traded now, especially financial services and other professional services. And when you look at the Chinese situation currently, there are some reasons, there are at least 3 reasons that I mentioned here, where the comparative advantage is likely to be is in high-tech companies, high technology industry, rather than services or anything else. And the 3 factors that I think are coming together to produce that is, first of all, the big improvements in educational attainment, both within China, because there's a big growth of university education at the technical level, but also in overseas universities. In every university in Britain and the United States has the majority of foreign students. It's by far the Chinese students, whereas when I first started at the LSE, the majority were always the Americans and the Southern Europeans. Now Americans and Southern Europeans are a tiny minority compared with Chinese. and they're also the best performing ones. Like, I never read so many Chinese names in a list as when the LSE asked me to present the first class honors degrees to students graduating. It was one Chinese name after another, until I came across an English name in between them, and then the whole hall jumped up to cheer. So given that performance, you would expect that to be reflected into private industry eventually. Then the second one is that there must be a lot of learning by doing, by accommodating the world's high-tech industries, even if it's only for assembly work. You know, like those of you who have iPhones, and I do see a lot of students, a lot of you having them. You will see if you read the small print at the back, it says "Designed in California, assembled in China." Well, that kind of company, there must be a lot of learning by doing by the workers who are there. So you have, on the one hand, the universities giving you the sort of more abstract training, more abstract knowledge. And then you have the companies here where there are a lot of spillovers, and we know from foreign direct investment, we know from work at the World Bank and so on, that there are a lot of spillovers onto the local economy. And finally, government, through the release of land, is encouraging R&D and high-tech companies much more than the low-cost, bigger manufacturing companies nowadays, which I've seen in my travels in places like Guangzhou and even Chengdu and further north. So those three factors, if you bring them together, then you should expect that they will sort of mesh together and produce and lead to the growth of high-tech big industry. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if in the years to come, Chinese industries start competing with the big Japanese and Korean companies in things like digital technology and telephony and so on. Because remember, I mean, like these, the big familiar household Japanese names and Korean names didn't exist so 40 years ago. I mean, they're fairly recent. 40 years ago, the top names in these fields were German and American and British, but not anymore, except for Apple, I guess, which has been very successful. Now as a final comment here on this is that is that I do think if all these things are going to come together, the management, there should be more attention being paid to management as well, development of management schools and business administration, how you run a big company, and especially on intellectual property rights. I'm not an expert on that actually, so it's all from conversations, but from what I understand, there is protection of intellectual property rights in China based on Chinese law, but it's not compatible with international law, from what I'm being told. And of course, if you want to borrow from abroad and interact more at this level with foreign countries, you do need to have intellectual property rights that are international rather than national. Education, you need good close cooperation between education and industry. The best example, of course, is Stanford University, Berkeley, and Silicon Valley in California, but we also have examples from Britain and from Massachusetts and MIT. It's happening here a little bit, not as much as it could be, but these things need time. We're getting there. So let me now move on to transition to services. Okay, so let's now talk about the implications that most new job creation from now on will be in services, both high-skilled services like financial services, business services, but also the low-skilled. And in fact, where you're likely to see the big numbers will be in the low-skilled services like retailing, healthcare, education, catering, domestic service. Those are the sectors that dominate job creation in Western countries that are past their fast rate of growth. In fact, where many years ago most school leavers would just leave school early and go into industry or coal mining or jobs like that, now they leave school a little bit later and they go into to work as retail assistants or as health workers, as in restaurants, hotels, and so on. And that's what you should expect to see here. You should expect to see those sectors to grow because we still don't have technology there to substitute human hands. You know, the personal service is still done by people. Now, but the high-tech business services will drive economic development and new technology in both industry and services, but they won't create many jobs. You know, the digitalization of the office, for example, the office revolution is, which again the United States are the leader here, is due to the very good top-level management education that they have there, but it's not attracting big employment numbers. Now, what are the policy needs here? Well, first, government schools and universities, they need to manage this transition. First of all, government with laws that govern employment in the service sector, which is quite distinct from manufacturing, because services is a more dispersed kind of employment, both geographically and also company-wise. You are not concentrated in one place, and you need different standards for that, and then different training that is suited to these professional services and the lower level. I mentioned the professional, I mentioned management school and what you need to do there, but lower level services like the ones I mentioned before, retailing and health and education, need different kinds of training and education than the one we provide. You see, this is something that you hardly ever hear, in fact, about when you hear about what training needs do we need, because most jobs, as an economy develops and as it deindustrializes, concern direct interaction with the customer. You know, it's like retailing is a good example, but also healthcare and education. Whereas most industrial jobs don't involve at all interaction with the customer. But at schools, we still don't teach people how to interact with other people. I don't know if you have any courses here in our school, but in fact, there's no teaching at all. You know, it could be psychology teaching, you know, how do you behave to people? It could be, you know, human interaction generally, sociology, whatever. That we don't teach at all. I mean, it's also a gap in our education system. It's not only here. And I think that's something that we do need desperately. The other thing we need, of course, which is something that I've been working on recently, very recently, the last 3 or 4 days, that is absent completely from schools is teaching about the environment. So my two new reform suggestions about school education is that there should be one course to teach people how to interact with other people so that they can become good in these kind of services when they come out of school, and another one to teach them how to about the environment so that when they come out of school they show a preference for green products over brown ones. Now, alongside that, what governments need to do, and in the Chinese government in particular, in fact, is to liberalize the service sector as much as possible. This is something that is not easy. It's proved a lot more difficult to liberalize services in Europe, for example, than it has been to liberalize industry. And in fact, the service sector in Europe is still not liberalized, even within the European Union. We have a single market, and our leaders are always going around saying how we achieved this great project with a single market since the mid-1980s. In fact, in private, they completely disagree how to liberalize the service sector. I don't know if most of the reasons I suspect are political. It's because you have strong vested interests from professional groups. And there are barriers to professional entry. You know, the legal profession is not liberalized, the accounting profession is not liberalized, and as we discovered recently, even taxi drivers are not liberalized in Germany, of all countries. And if you're going to have a service sector that will grow and have standards, good standards throughout the country, so that people can migrate where the jobs are, and provide the same kind of standard throughout the country, not only in some cities, then you do need to liberalize, and you do need to have common standards. And as I was saying, that proved very difficult. Air transport, for example, is completely regulated. It's not liberalized. It's proving much more difficult to provide a competitive environment in the service sector, to the extent that we've provided a competitive environment in the industrial sector. As I was saying, it's not clear to me why that is the case. I think there are more political reasons than economic. There is no reason why economically you shouldn't do it. But it's a big barrier to political leaders to be doing it. Here, of course, the biggest sort of gap you have in opening, not here, I mean in China, anything but in Hong Kong, actually, because I was going to mention the financial sector. The biggest obstacle, if you like, to open free market competition that you have in China is in the financial sector, which Hong Kong, of course, is number 2 in the world, I think, as far as liberalization of the financial sector is, which I'm very puzzled why that's the case, because it took me a month to open an account in a Hong Kong bank, which you would think that a competitive industry like the Hong Kong one is supposed to be should need less than a month to check all your credentials and open your account. But anyway, that's by the side. But in China, the problem with finance is still controlled by the state, and the result of that, of course, is the very high interest rates compared with international interest rates that Chinese companies have to pay, which again is an impediment to growth. Finance has to come from other sources, not the banks. And so far they've been lucky in that there is a very high rate of saving by private households, which is being reinvested, but that's an unusual situation. I'm sure if the financial sector were to be opened up by more and encourage more competition, then interest rates in China would come down from the current levels of about 6%, when in all other countries of the world you can borrow for 2 to 3%. Finally, with respect to service jobs, I use health as an illustration, because health is it's a big headache to all governments, and yet it's one sector that is going to grow and grow. The reason being that good quality health care, especially care rather than emergency medical intervention, is what we call a luxury good, in that as your standard of living rises, you expect better and better health care, because it makes you feel good. You know, what's the point of having all the money if you don't feel good about yourself? So demand will keep rising, but then another factor, of course, that demand will keep rising is the aging of the population, especially the Chinese population, which is going to age before its time. because of the one-child policy, which persisted over 3 or 4 decades. And what we have there, the reason I'm saying that's the problem that all governments are facing, is that governments feel the need to support healthcare provision. There is an increasing demand for health provision, which is moving faster than GDP. So if you look at systems that we support, for example, in Britain we have, at least the original idea was that it was going to be a 100% subsidized system, a national health service. But then if the costs to maintain standards are rising faster than GDP, the only way you can support that is by having increasing tax rates, which is not feasible anymore because tax rates are supposed to be very high as they are. So a 100% subsidized system, if you try to bring in some contribution from patients through prescription charges, for example, through the back door, is just not enough. Something else needs to be found to make the system more sustainable. But then if you look at the other extreme, which is the United States relying only on private insurance, except for the lower end of the market, which they've been struggling for decades to find a good system, and they haven't yet, you get the result that they have there, which is that healthcare costs have risen since 1980. Healthcare costs have risen by a factor of 7 more than the costs of other services. In fact, it's so expensive to get healthcare in the United States that even international insurance companies exclude the United States when they insure you for travel there. And on top of that, you don't have very good treatment, very good standards. The United States, amongst developed countries, it has the biggest fatality rate from heart attacks, for example. And the reason for that is that they instead of giving instant care, they spend time checking your paperwork before they give you instant care, which is the result of the private insurance provision and the very high costs. So something else needs to be found here. The alternative, of course, and what you do find a lot in Southern Europe, which employs fewer people in the health sector than elsewhere, is that healthcare is provided by the family. When there is someone sick, a sick parent, then one of the children, usually the daughter, goes off work to look after the aging parents, simply because this provision is not provided centrally. My favorite system is the Scandinavian system, where all these jobs are government jobs, but it would be impossible to implement anywhere else, I think, because mainly being a Southern European, the main impediment is not high taxes, it's the fact that Northern Scandinavians trust their government. There's no way a Southern European government would be trusted to provide good quality services. Italian, Greek, Spanish, you put them all together. In fact, once I was involved with research on this with an Italian foundation, and we decided to do a survey on whether Italian mothers who don't go to work, as a rule, whether if they had childcare provision, as in Sweden, whether they would join the labor force. Most of them answered no, because they wouldn't trust the state to look after their children. They trust their mothers and themselves. It was done during the time of Berlusconi's rule, so maybe it's not surprising that they didn't trust the state at that time. I don't know if things have changed now. Okay, and finally, social support systems in the new deindustrialized society. Well, unemployment is an inevitable outcome of transition and an inevitable outcome of urbanization. In a dynamic economy, which is what the Chinese economy is becoming, the post-agricultural economy, if you like, is one where there's continuous job churning under imperfect information. So you do need to have some unemployment of people in between jobs. That applies, of course, to new graduates as well. You do need to have some graduate unemployment. You don't want to jump into the first job you find. But the question is, how much are you going to have, and for how long? That's another issue. So some unemployment is necessary in a modern society. How much? Well, in Europe and the United States, when we have 5 to 6% unemployment, we are saying that we've reached full employment and everyone is happy and the government gets re-elected because they've done so well as to bring unemployment down to 5 to 6%. Not that it's although the rule usually with governments is that they can make the situation worse, but very rarely better. Actually, when the best they can do is to leave the market alone, in other words. at least with respect to the numbers of unemployed people, not with respect to their standard of living, obviously. And the level of unemployment depends on institutional arrangements and the structure of industry, but it's about that in sort of post-industrialized service economies. But I do believe that the government has a very big role to play in supporting unemployment, because there is so much chance involved, pure luck, that does influence outcomes for a long time to come. You know, you might be a young person, you might end up being unemployed 6 months, 9 months instead of what you would expect normal, which would be 2 to 3 months. And that has implications for your future career for over a decade, for example. Well, that's where government has a role to play to try and avert that. Begin by telling you what a poor policy practice is. A poor policy practice is when the government tries to support the unemployed by putting restrictions on employers in the restructuring of their companies and on getting rid of workers. That's a bad policy, because employers are not good at providing social services. Employers are there to create jobs and produce, and what they should be doing is to be looking for new opportunities, new technology opportunities, how to improve productivity, move on to a higher level of production. And if it's necessary to retrain workers or change modes of production where you get rid of some workers, hire others, they should. It's good for their company, it's good for the economy if they're able to do it. When government imposes restrictions on the firing of workers, then it makes employers too cautious about opening up new jobs, especially in risky ventures. And that's not good for an economy to take advantage of changes taking place in the world today. Such practices could affect job creation. Now, you might say, well, what about, aren't workers exposed to too many risks? I do agree that if you leave them alone, they're exposed to too many risks. And in fact, we see that happening in the United States. It's been happening since the mid-90s, that some people blame these new risks that workers have been exposed to the fact that inequality has increased so much in the United States. And the way that inequality has increased is through the high wages rising and the low wages staying stagnant. So I do believe that government should take some action to avoid that, but not by restricting what employers are doing. The best way to take the action is by ensuring the incomes of workers and by helping them find a job when they lose the job, because the best kind of insurance for a worker is if a labor market generates a lot of jobs, generates a lot of turnover, so there's rotation of the jobs and durations of unemployment are short. But if by any chance it happens that the duration of unemployment gets long, then government should step in and provide the necessary training or necessary investigation as to why the duration of unemployment is long and try and avert that. And taking that action at about 4 months of unemployment, even in recession, is a good policy and is feasible. Although, again, the only countries that have really succeeded in doing that are the Scandinavian countries and maybe Netherlands and Germany, actually, recently as well. Definitely not the whole of the advanced world. The United States is not taking any interest at all in that kind of policy. And Southern Europe is paying lip service to it. They say they are interested in it, but they are not doing anything about it. The European Union actually is not doing much about it either. It's not only them. So I believe that that's the key to success in a modern labor market. So in the social welfare system is one where businesses are flexible to take advantage of new opportunities in an economy that changes so rapidly, and government is providing the support for workers who fall between jobs. And they do it both through passive income support and through active support after 3 or 4 months of unemployment. Now, other social needs that once the country becomes urbanized arise. Now, you might say, why do these needs arise now? Things like mental health, disability, inequality, poverty. Well, the main reason for that actually is the decline of the family, because in an agricultural economy, all these, what's mentioned up there, support is provided by the family, but in an urbanized industrial society, you can't expect the family to continue to provide that kind of support. It becomes more dispersed, it's more difficult to communicate within the family. So the state, again, needs to take on that function. And what I describe nowadays is called the flexicurity system. It's one that requires the cooperation of unions, employers, governments, of course, adhere to the standards of the International Labour Office at the very minimum. There are negotiations with unions, but the negotiations are always in the spirit of what's the best for the company, because that's also the best for the workers. And then the government providing the support for those who are unfortunate enough to lose their jobs. So that's the end. The conclusion is that Chinese governments and businesses do need to pay attention to all those factors I mentioned. I spoke in general lines about our experiences in Europe, and I'm happy to take your questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your educational presentation. Professor Pissarides has kindly agreed to take a few questions from the audience. May I please invite Professor Zhang Junsen, the Wei Lin Professor of Economics and the Chairman of the Department of Economics of the university, to please come forward and conduct a Q&A session.
My name's Merlis. I'm an economist.
I think you're well known in this environment.
And I'm going to ask a question that's not exactly economics. I was thinking of your service industry difference and your concentration some of the time on where technical progress is going to be happening, where the growth is going to be happening. If we look at the two extreme cases of industry and services, I think that science-based industry and entertainment and the arts in services. It's a common observation that the fine arts do not progress. There simply is no technical advance. It's not exactly right, but people say, and science progresses. Does this give us an indication of where in the long run the pattern of growth will go, if it's indeed the arts side that is going to be increasingly important?
Well, you're probably familiar with the Baumol claim in the 1960s that eventually we will all be artists and all industrial goods will be produced by machines, which is not far off the truth. In fact, they say as t goes to infinity, as you would say. But it's certainly the case, and we're observing it already, that labor is moving to these unproductive, low productivity growth sectors, like the arts is the primary example, and they're leaving the high productivity sectors. So the difference, though, and what, at least when Baumol was writing, what he missed was that it's not only art that has that feature, but much bigger numbers are in services, especially health provision and education, actually, to some extent. It's surprising how video recording and other potential educational methods have failed when compared with the personal contact between student and teacher. And of course, in healthcare, we still don't know how to handle nursing, for example, through machinery. So what I expect is that other than, like now we're seeing in some countries 75% people employed in these kinds of jobs, up to 75%, we're going to see 90% employed in them, if not more. And hopefully the arts will attract big numbers as well, because I think we don't have enough of it.
Talking about making the service sector more liberalized, nowadays there is this rising sharing economy, where it's internet-based and mobile device-based app that actually is rising in a lot of countries, and it helps to liberalize taxi industry, hotel industry, and in China, even the finance industry. So I wanted to ask you two aspects on that. One is how you view the perspective of this sharing economy. And second, because there's a lot of discussion about regulations on those sharing economies, and in China we know that the rule of law is not that strong. But do you think that the peer reviewing among the individual users can also liberalize the law service provided by the government in disciplining the service providers? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm very much in favor of that, in fact, and liberalizing services through that, making more use of the internet. Where there is more use, there is an increase in efficiency in that it cuts down the human time that it takes. If you take the example of taxis, of how long it takes you to call and wait to answer the phone or go out in the street to find a taxi, rather than do it. There is strong resistance to that by the existing groups, and the best example we saw recently that Germany disallowed that use, which is, I keep mentioning that example because my own country, I'm sort of Greek from Cyprus, so I consider both Greece and Cyprus as my countries, and of course Britain is my country, so I've got loads. And Greece and Cyprus have been suffering through deep recessions in the last 3 years because of German-imposed policies of how to liberalize our industry, which is non-existent, by the way, but that's what our economies, our public sectors. And then at the same time, they go and restrict their service sector even more than what is restricted now by disallowing the things that you're mentioning. So there's this contradiction in their policy. And so I do believe that liberalization should go that way. And of course, the more you liberalize, the bigger incentive you give to people to invent these apps and use them more. I mean, I have started using some of those myself, and they're wonderful things. I thought I would be too old to become so digitalized in my use of services, but in fact, it works most of the time. So I agree. I mean, that's the way that automation and mechanization will go in the service sector, in the office. Like in the old days, robots replaced assembly lines in manufacturing. In modern days, using a tablet and an application on it will replace the telephone call or the actual search in the street. One nice thing actually for someone working in search is that although these methods are used a lot in job search, they had no impact at all on the friction and how it affects unemployment and job match in the labor market. It's a puzzle. I don't know what it is. I think it's something that a PhD student should solve and not me.
Yes, no sooner has Uber created jobs for driving cars as Google has created the driverless car and created the entire transport industry. The largest employer in the United States made all those jobs redundant. The difference in the industrial and the digital revolution, or one of them, is that the cost of capital, the cost of computers, is substantially lower than the cost of the machines that replaced jobs in agriculture and in industry. So my question is whether or not you think this change, which appears to be happening very quickly, will actually disrupt the Chinese switch from industrial to service-based economy if these machines that are capable of replacing the mid-level service jobs become affordable and developed before China hits the stage where it's able to switch.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question. Yeah, of course, and no one knows, of course, the answer to that. It's a little bit like you're saying, given that technology in other, there's a more general issue, in fact, that what you are saying is an example on that. That if other countries are technologically more advanced, can you jump a stage, as it were, and still continue performing? I can't see why not. Actually, I mean we've seen that in some of the European countries that developed later than, say, Britain and Germany, where they bypassed one stage of industrialization completely. In fact, my own country, although it's tiny, completely bypassed industrialization. It moved from agriculture to services. And because it has tourism as a big export service, it's been using tourist revenue to buy manufacturing goods from elsewhere. And it didn't disrupt the economy in any big way. So I have faith that economies can adapt to the new technology. Now, even if they bypass some of the stages, like you've mentioned. Now, China, though, is a unique example because of the size that it has and what, where are the jobs going to come from if they don't come through the traditional service sectors before they start. In other words, if the move is too fast, how are they going to adapt? And I think that could be an issue, in fact, if you do things too quickly. I think the gradual adoption of the new technology, I think, would probably be more advisable for a big country like China, given the potential disruption. But I'm just thinking off the top of my head.
I want to ask a question about the professional education in China right now. In April, the government launched a new reform that it wants to transfer like half of the universities, which means 600 universities, into professional education institute. And in September, it published two documents, which it says that the government wants half of the students at high school level. They start to get professional education from the high school level. So I want to ask, do you think it's an efficient way to promote the professional education?
I mean, when you say professional, you mean it including apprenticeships?
Yeah, like teach you how to do hair, how to maybe drive an excavator, something like that. It's true.
Well,
Vocational.
No, I'll tell you.
Oh, sorry. It's vocational education.
Yeah. No, you see, right? I mean, you cannot answer a question like that generally applying to the whole country because there are different needs across the country to different industries, and when you talk to CEOs of companies, and I have come, I mean, recently in meetings recently, I have come across a lot of owners of big companies, big names internationally that you would know them, but there's no point in mentioning them, who would benefit from this kind of professional education that you're mentioning. And when you ask them what they consider to be the biggest improvement in education, they immediately say that the biggest improvement would be to have more of this professional education that you mentioned, but one which is done in collaboration with companies that operate in each local labor market, and that they thought it would be very different across regions of a big country like China or across smaller countries elsewhere, because if you look at a multinational company, they claim is that the bottlenecks they face in labor markets in different countries are different. They are not the same everywhere. So if it's a policy that is imposed by the central government, is saying you should all get the same kind of professional training everywhere throughout China, it wouldn't be the right policy. It would increase the migration movements that they are trying to stop at the same time, for example. But a policy where they get companies that will locate in different regions, specializing in different things, and in consultation with high schools and universities, introduce the professional training that is best suited to the companies there or to the service provided in those regions, would be a good policy, because it will decentralize production more and will prepare school leavers more to enter the professional environment and get trained better. And you shouldn't run down things like hairdressing and that because those are luxury goods. I mean, there's more and more demand there, and of course the way to make them more respectable is to increase the cost, is to pay them more. You see, any service that is expensive has a sense of respectability about it. So you should charge a lot for haircuts, and then they will be respected professions. But then you cut your hair less frequently.
So I'd like to ask a question about unemployment and the structural transformation. So we know there is a spatial feature in China, namely in the coastal areas like Shanghai, Guangzhou, Beijing. They're very developed. So they're moving from industry to services. But at the same time, the interior region, the western region, still in the process of industrialization, and urbanization. So my question is, now it seems like China runs into some kind of dilemma. That is, if, say, we do not regulate labor, prevent labor from migrating from the poor western region to urban region, then they will go to Shanghai. But since the housing price is high, so the labor cost high, so which means that if then although China had a large pool of labor, but if all the labor moved to Shanghai, then that will reduce China's comparative advantage in cheaper labor because of high living costs there. But if we, on the other hand, industrialization, manufacturing exhibits the Marshalling externality. So my question is, do you think it is socially better to regulate the sort of prevent labor from migrating from western areas to coastal areas from a social efficiency point of view? Thank you.
Yeah, that's obviously it's a question that's bothered me a lot talking about it because if you think of parallels in other countries, like if you take the whole of Europe, for example, if you forget national borders, then it's still smaller than China, and both geographically and population-wise. Now, if you go, and then we have the language barrier as well for mobility. But if you go to European leaders and tell them there should be completely free movement of labor because of, for whatever reasons, then there will be strong objections there saying, no, you can't have this. There are countries that you cannot open up because they are poor and they correspond to your Western regions. So, on the other hand, if you look at the United States, it's always had complete free movement of labor, and they never faced these problems. They developed big urban centers in different places. You have New York, Pittsburgh in the industrial days, Chicago, Los Angeles, and so on. So it's difficult to draw parallels from other countries on the migration. Now, if you look at China specifically, I think, without knowing what the answer to this is, but I think it would be a mistake to use land prices as the regulator. Because of the common language and culture and so on, people do move more. So the regulator, if you exclude those, become land prices, like you say, and congestion, basically, that people don't move to Shanghai and Beijing because land prices are so high they cannot afford it, and there is congestion, and many people don't like wasting time in transport. But that's the wrong allocation mechanism, is to say that land price is the allocation mechanism for people to move. So the obvious conclusion for that is that, yes, you have to find ways to restrict migration. But then the method they have now for restricting, which it's got that short Chinese word that I can't remember. Yeah, that one. It's not good because it creates second-class citizens within the same urban environment. And it's not a satisfactory outcome again. So ultimately, the only satisfactory solution you find is the one where you make people want to stay where they are, the vast majority. And that and the state has to play a big role there in the use of land, in the provision of infrastructure, of good housing, subsidized housing if possible, job creation, creating new urban centers inland. And the biggest obstacle to inland development, of course, is transportation, and then improve air transportation, railway transportation to the other areas, so as to make them want to stay there. What you do in the interim, before that's done, it's difficult. You know, maybe having a temporary restriction on migration completely. But I would still be against the current system of having them migrate but treating them as second-class citizens. I would be more in favor of saying you're not allowed to move unless you have a job to move to, for example, which is what's done with international migration, on a point system, you know, that kind of thing.
I look at things like climate change and inequality, and that's going to show in the questions I want to ask. I'm thinking along two parts. First, we see you talking about increasing specialization towards the service sector. And that immediately makes me think, well, if you've got specialization, and we also know that there's going to be changes in climate, increased adverse extreme events, how do you think that would impact on the resilience of economies if the majority of the labor force is in the service sector? And as a consequence of that, how do you deal with things like inequality arising from recessions that hit when demand for services declines and the owners of capital are presumably those who were fairly wealthy to begin with? Do you think that regulation can cover a society, or that a lot more work needs to be done to protect?
Inequality in the modern service sector, I think, is the biggest problem that we have to face, and the reason for the inequality is that modern services are internationalized, where, you know, if you succeed, then the market is almost unlimited. I mean, like if you look at the wealthiest people in the service sector, for example, you know, Microsoft succeeded and created a bunch of the wealthiest people internationally, you know, that kind of thing. Google has done the same. Now, if you try and regulate the development of those services, you would be doing more damage, more harm than good. My preferred approach there is to deal with it by dealing with the low incomes, making sure that there are no, you know, first that the market works at the lower end of the skill distribution, and second, providing either direct social services as is done in Sweden, for example, or provide or have favorable tax treatment if you have the progressive tax. To support the low incomes, and then just ignore the inequality that is caused at the high end. Partly because high-end people are so mobile, and they're mobile in very obscure ways. I mean, like, you know, in Britain 2 years ago, when it's exposed that companies like Starbucks and Amazon don't pay any taxes, it was essentially because of mobility that you never thought it was there. You know, setting up a company to supply coffee beans in Luxembourg, selling coffee beans at extremely high prices, so the retailer makes losses from making coffee. You know, like, who would imagine it? For as long as we don't have tax harmonization, and we're not going to have it internationally, then there are more risks, I think, with if you try and regulate the top end. But then it doesn't mean that you should resign from doing anything about the bottom end. I think for as long as you raise the bottom end, just ignore what's going on at the top. That's my... It's more of a practical solution, a practical suggestion than the ideal. You know?
How do you think the prospect of medical industry or healthcare industry in mainland in the next 20 years? As we all know, the medical industry and the healthcare industry nowadays are centralized in the official hospital system. Do you think there will be a trend of liberalization of a medical industry, and hence more cooperation could rise within this trend? Thank you.
If I understood correctly, you're asking me about the medical industry.
Yeah, and maybe the healthcare industry.
Do you mean Do you mean like hospitals or people who produce medical equipment?
Not hospital. Hospitals are so official. I think the folk corporation or some else institution organized by the folk people, not that official.
Well, and what's the question about that? About regulation?
Sorry. I mean, the resources nowadays in the mainland of the medical industry or healthcare industry are centralized in the hospitals. So do you think there will be a trend of liberalization of this kind of healthcare business in the mainland in the next few years?
That's what I mentioned as an example of it's difficult how to deal with that. Again, what I believe the best system would be there would be to leave that in the, more in a regulated private sector there. In fact, that's probably the only sector where I would favor more regulation actually than anywhere as the medical one because of what we are seeing in the United States, which is something to be avoided anywhere. But then provide only partial support for people using those services. You know, say have it as means tested at lower incomes. You might want to support 100% for some groups, but support 80% for most groups, and then at higher levels support less, which you do through the annual tax return of the family, which will give bigger incentive, of course, to conceal income, but that's another issue. But I'm not sure what the situation is currently in China to tell you that you need more liberalization or more regulation, I'm afraid. But I think that's a sector where you need to strike a balance between the public and the private. There are good systems operating in smaller countries like the Holland, the Dutch system in the Netherlands is a good one for sharing the costs between state and private. The French is not bad actually either, from what I know. But
okay, the last question. So since I have picked a lot of questions from here, so maybe I give the chance to this girl. Okay.
My question is, do you think China has the potential to maintain the high growth rate, since our GDP now just equals to the early 1950s of Japan and 1960s of Singapore? But at that level, Japan maintains the about 9.2% growth rate for 20 years, and Singapore maintains about 8.6% for 20 years. So do you think China also has the potential to maintain the high growth rate? And if you think so, well, what do you think we should prepare and establish to maintain this level? And if you don't think so, what do you think are the main obstacles? Thank you.
It's an easy answer. I don't have to tell you what you have to do because I don't think you can sustain it for that level. But as I was saying, if you look at the statistics and what's happening there over another decade, it wouldn't surprise me if it goes for another decade, but not at those levels. I think Japan had that fast growth rate, but it started from a different base, and a lot of it was due to the reconstruction after the war and the American financing of the reconstruction. Singapore is too small to compare with China. It's just focused more on services. You should. I doubt actually whether you could sustain even the 7.5% that you had recently over many years because of the size of the country. But like you're saying, it's good that you mentioned it because it gives me a chance to say, you should be looking at per capita incomes as well as the overall. I think in China there is a little bit too much emphasis on the overall size of the economy instead of the per capita. Living standards depend on per capita income. In fact, when you look at the overall size of the economy, I don't think it matters for anything other than military power, actually. Because, people don't don't feel better off because the country is bigger, except that the army can be bigger and it's got only one command. Whereas if you break it up into smaller countries, there will be very different commands. So you need, I think, like now in terms of living standards, China is somewhere like, is it up to 40% of the United States? It might even be less. So you would think that it would be possible to sustain high growth rates, but not Japan, because Japan had, it started from a highly educated labor force and zero capital because of the destruction after the war. And then American money combined with the highly educated labor force in the 1950s to grow over the next 20. And of course, I don't know, I mean, I've been drawing parallels from Europe because that's the one I know, and a little bit from the United States, but of course, the big mistakes that you have to avoid is the Japanese one, where you have these very fast growth rates and suddenly zero growth rate for the following 20 years.
Okay, I know many of you still have many questions, and we can never ask enough questions for Nobel laureate. But unfortunately, time is running out, and Professor Pisaridis has other commitment. So let's thank the speaker for a very wonderful speech.
Thank you, Professor Pisaridis and Professor Zhang. To show the university's appreciation, may I please invite our provost, Professor Benjamin Hua, to present a souvenir to Professor Pisaridis.